In this video, we are doing a deep dive into the brand new POP and workforce system that will be implemented with the next patch for Stellaris, the 4.0 Phoenix update. So far, the devs have been very cagey on specifics, but finally, they're starting to nail some things down and tell us what is going to be happening. The big headlines so far: Clerks are dead, welcome the new role called civilians, and POP growth is changing massively. Oh, and also, POPs are dead too. Let's dive in and find out what's going on. The developers have already told us back in Dev Diary 366 that the POP and job system introduced in Stellaris 2.2 Le Guin has always had a significant performance impact in the late game. They have been working on incremental improvements ever since they introduced this system. In the new update Stellaris 4.0 Phoenix, POPs will be grouped into POP groups based on their species, strata, ethics, and faction. These POP groups will produce something called workforce now, which will be used to fill or partially fill jobs. As a part of this change, the developers are changing the overall scale of POPs as well. Most things that previously affected or manipulated one POP will now affect or manipulate groups of 100 POPs. So basically they've scaled up the POP numbers, so where there was 1, there is now 100. Starting planets, for example, should now have, I believe, 2,800 POPs on rather than just 28. The new system can manipulate any number of POPs within a group just as easily as manipulating one POP. And we're now going to look at some of the benefits of the finer resolution as we go forwards. The primary desire the devs had with these changes is to improve late game performance. But while working on it, they took the opportunity to streamline some aspects of planetary management and improve the planetary UI. Let's now take a look at some of the details. In Stellaris, the core economic loop since 2.2 has been POPs filled jobs and jobs produced resources. With the 4.0 Phoenix update, the developers are making a subtle but important change that will improve performance. POPs will now generate something called workforce, which is used to fill jobs, and planets themselves will produce resources. Somewhat like the old system where we had planet tiles and the tiles produced resources as long as there was a POP assigned to them. At a basic level, this works almost the same way as previously. By default, every POP generates one workforce, so jobs are still filled at the same rate. However, this shift is crucial for back-end performance improvements. They are now reducing the number of calculations the game needs to make each month. Let's look at an example and we can see why it's changing. So the current version of the game, 3.14, let's say we take a planet with 100 POPs working metallurgist jobs. 20 of those 100 have a 10% production bonus from a species trait. These 100 POPs together would produce 612 alloys per month. But in order to work that out, the game would have to check every POP individually. 80 of them would produce the standard amount, while 20 would get a 10% alloy production bonus from their species trait. So we have 100 POPs working, and every month, possibly even every tick, we would be calculating every output from each one of these POPs. So that is 100 calculations from these 100 POPs. Let's look at what it is changing to. In 4.0, instead of tracking individual POPs, they now track workforce filling up the job. Jobs are now filled by 10,000 workforce, since POPs are scaled up by 100. That is, 100 POPs produce 10,000 workforce. 8,000 of these workforce come from regular POPs, while 2,000 workforce comes from the bonus earning POPs. The species bonus is no longer plus 10% output, it is plus 10% bonus workforce when working alloy jobs. These POPs would then contribute an extra 200 workforce, making the total 10,200 workforce. The bonus workforce is allowed to go over the required workforce for a job, yielding extra production. If 100 workforce still produces 6 alloys, the planet still produces 612 alloys, which is the same output but with a different system. If you didn't catch the difference here, let me try to explain. So in the new system, the pops are going to generate this value called workforce, and then the workforce is applied to the job, meaning to look at the output of that job, we only need to keep a track of the workforce. We don't need to do an individual calculation for every single pop. This should dramatically increase performance later on in the game by massively reducing the number of calculations needed to do on every pop. The key benefit from this new system is efficiency. Instead of iterating through and calculating production for every individual pop, the game will only check once per planet. That is an order of magnitude fewer calculations. This makes the system more scalable and also massively improves performance, while still allowing for species-based bonuses and modifiers. Most existing species traits that affect job production will be converted over into workforce bonuses or a planet-based modifier. As always, the final balancing will be refined throughout the open beta, which is coming soon, TM. There are a few quirks and subtleties about how this interacts with other modifiers. Bonus workforce as a modifier is much more powerful than bonus production due to the two of them stacking multiplicatively rather than additively. So, what are we saying here? There are still some bonuses in the game from technologies, traditions, that sort of thing, which are going to add bonus production on, but the species traits will be adding initial additional workforce, which is then scaled by those other bonus modifiers. This makes species traits much more powerful than they were previously. Previously, they would add together the multiplicative bonuses would not be multiplicative, they would stack additively. So if you had plus 20% species output and plus 80% from tech, you get plus 100%. Now with the new system, that would be a combined bonus, the 20% and the 80% of plus 116%, which is much better. Pop groups are currently split up by species, strata, ethics, and faction. If you end up in a case where a pop group is not completely uniform, for example, if 20% of the pop group are recent refugees and thus happier than the rest, then the differences will be averaged across the pop group and calculated based on the average, which means you'll still get the same output but with fewer calculations. If none of this feels like it makes sense, the developers are saying that's okay. This is mostly a behind-the-scenes change. Jobs will require workforce to fill them, and that will be generated by pops. They have some ideas about ways to expand upon this in the future, such as replacing part of the workforce with automation by using a building, but at the moment this is the main change coming. With more granular pop units, the developers now have more ability to support simultaneous growth of pops on a planet. Each species present on a planet will grow normally, and with the smaller unit size, they will grow every month. This does result in several benefits, including multi-species empires not getting their growth dominated by underrepresented species. This also lets the developers remove the floor on the colony pop growth. What am I talking about with that floor? Well, logistic growth, the logistic growth calculation used, actually has a minimum level that it will add, and it will not be taking away from your growth when you have too few pops. Now they're going to be easing those restrictions off, so when a planet has very few pops just after it's colonized, my suspicion is you're going to have basically abysmal growth because it will be destroyed by negative logistic growth. This does mean that newly settled colonies will be very reliant on migration to grow their population until they develop to the point where they can support their own pop growth because they have reached over a certain threshold, the number has gotten high enough, their population is large enough that the logistic growth equation will be satisfied and no longer give a negative output. This also removes a long-running issue where spamming colonies regardless of habitability simply for the minimum flat pop growth was optimal. Now, you will get basically no pop growth on very tiny colonies with very few pops. Xenocompatibility will pool all species on a multi-species planet together to calculate their growth rate, then split the growth proportionally across the various species. Why is that important? Well, if you have a small number of pops on your planet of different species, they will have independent growth values, so they won't actually grow very much until you get a significant population. So xenodiverse empires, those that do not safeguard the purity of their planets by keeping only their primary species on, will actually get significantly lower growth than those that only have a single species, because you're basically losing growth on those different population units that aren't contributing to the big pool of pops with the logistic pop growth equation. If I'm not really making very much sense here, I can do a further video to explain this, or just explain in the comments, so write down below why I'm saying that xenophilia just became crap, basically. That is, of course, unless you take xenocompatibility, which completely negates any of the negatives of having multiple species. Assembly will work largely in the same way as it did before, except that the fractional assembly will become micropops thanks to the finer resolution of pops. Machine and organic assembly will no longer conflict with one another, so you will be able to have both machine and organic assembly present on a planet, as the organic pops will handle their own growth, while all mechanical assembly will be channeled towards the highest score mechanical pop templates available, whichever one the game thinks is best based on its internal logic. So our new colonies in 4.0 will be extremely reliant on migration from the homeworld until they reach a critical mass of inhabitants where they can begin to support themselves from a pop growth perspective. The developers are now adding a new population stratum called civilians, or residents for species without full citizenship. These civilians form the generally happy and content base of your empire, and they will trickle out to the colonies looking for better opportunities. Unemployed pops will still exist, and they will downgrade through the strata, with unemployed worker stratum pops demoting into civilians over time. This will have an impact on stability, as civilians are largely content and non-disruptive. So these civilians are basically going to form a new lower class strata on your worlds that, if you have unemployed pops, eventually they will join this category and then seek out work on other planets by migrating abroad. Let's look into some details here, mostly for modders, but let's just find out a bit more of the nitty gritty. So the new system, unemployed specialists will still exist there. It is technically a job, and there will be one for each strata. Every job can have a demotion target assigned to it and a time. In the current implementation, all of these specialist stratum jobs will demote to unemployed specialist, then unemployed specialist will demote to unemployed worker, and unemployed worker will demote to civilian, as long as they give up on their dreams of productivity and veg out in front of your holoscreen. Alright, if you're not currently confused, let's go into even more detail. So there are actually going to be many more strata than we previously listed. The current list includes elites and then unemployed elites. That's your current top strata, your politicians, your research directors, that sort of thing. Then below that we have specialists, unemployed specialists, enslaved specialists, unemployed enslaved specialists for indentured servitude. Note, this does seem like it means now slaves and slave species cannot easily be bounced around from specialist down to worker. That is the implication I'm reading here, because we finally get unemployed specialists, whereas previously, if you had an unemployed slave specialist, they would instantly demote to an unemployed slave worker. Below that we'll have workers, unemployed workers, slave workers, unemployed slaves, and then finally civilians. Below that residents, that is non-citizens, criminals, and last but least is pre-sapients. Damn those buggers. For Gestalts, it's a little bit simpler. You have complex drones, menial drones, maintenance drones, which is now the civilian equivalent. Unemployed complex and menial drones will demote directly to this, skipping the unemployed state. That is a massive buff that Gestalt always get. Below that, deviant drones, slaves for grid amalgamation or livestock, biotrophies, unemployed biotrophies, and finally pre-sapients. I must admit I find it funny that slaves are technically a higher strata than biotrophies, but I guess what does that say about Gestalts? There are likely to be more once the developers are done, including the various purge types as well. Like many of the other changes, it's all about removing iteration. Instead of going through the pops to find the unemployed ones, the game will now already know that any pops in the specialist unemployed stratum are in fact unemployed. When a specialist job opens up, they have a smaller pool of candidates that are pre-identified, so there will be fewer calculations needed all the time, thank God. And on top of that, the game will already have a clear priority of who has dibs on the job, so again, fewer calculations. In this model, slaves would demote to slaves unemployed, job stratum, and go no further. They'll never hit the content state of residents and civilians, of course, because they're slaves. Based on playtesting, they might end up adding a slave specialist unemployed, and that's why it's there in the category. And if you're enjoying this video, please reinforce the class system with that like button. Your homeworld at the start of the game will start with a fairly large pool of civilians to support your early expansion. The devs are a bit worried about early conquest of homeworlds being too easy of a snowball with this increased starting pop count. So they are considering various ways of making it more challenging to take homeworlds in the early to mid game. Because of course homeworlds have that massive population, they are already functioning worlds, and unlike your colonies, they will not take very long to get off the ground if you conquer one. One idea they have includes having civilians create impromptu defensive militias to help defend their home, and possibly starting you off with a few defensive platforms. Another idea is for aggressively invaded civilians to take resistance jobs that they must then demote out of over time, which would massively reduce productivity. The number of civilians converted to this new job and how long it takes them to drop out of it would be modified depending on how their people are being treated by their new and their old masters, which would suggest if you invade a planet where the owner had, let's say, slaver guild, so 40% of the planet was slaves, and you implement utopian abundance, they're going to absolutely love you for that, and they probably won't be resisting for that long. This would also mean that conquest as an aggressive xenophobic slaving empire becomes less profitable immediately and will take longer to get going. But conquest as a democratic xenophilic empire that really treats its citizens nicely may actually be very, very powerful. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. We'll have to see how it's implemented. The next thing I want to talk about is possibly a small change, however, it is a change I am very happy to see. Clerks are now dead, ladies and gentlemen. Long live civilians. The devs are currently still experimenting with the effects living standards will have on civilians and pops in general. It's likely that more of the trade generation from living standards will be shifted to the civilian stratum, and production from unemployed pops in the old system may also move to the civilians. This will give them some of the function of clerks in the old economic model. In Gestalt empires, they are likely going to be outright named maintenance drones rather than civilians. Which indicates that clerks, that despicable role we've tried to get rid of since time immemorial, will be entirely gone. And I am so happy about this. Having said that, now we've got these civilians hanging around, loafers that aren't contributing economically to our empire, and maybe we should do something about those folks. The devs are also renaming the ruler stratum to elites, as you might have noticed earlier, so ruler won't be double dipping between your empire's ruler and the top economic stratum. Overall, the changes we've gone through today are going to have, if the devs are to be believed, massive positive improvements for performance in the mid to late game. This is wonderful news. Let's see how it's implemented, let's see how this functions in-game before we decide if it's still fun. I think the system may be better than the old system, though overall it sounds like it's still going to be very similar in terms of jobs that are increased and decreased, prioritization, and that sort of thing. If you enjoyed this video on the changes coming to Stellaris in 4.0, but you would like to know more, you'll probably want to hear all about the changes coming to trade, and how trade will now be a resource that your fleets require for upkeep. And there's going to be a bit of a logistics system tagged in behind that. If you want to find out more about trade and logistics in 4.0, click the video on screen now.